Welcome back again. If you're just joining us now, we are actually finishing up our Beatitudes. We have been going through the Sermon on the Mount, and we've been basically trying to tackle this question, which is, what does God have in mind when He wants us to have a blessed life? And we've been going through, different ideas of what a blessed life looks like. So, for example, the very, very first week when we talked about a blessed life, we talked about how a blessed life is actually an approved life, right? Makarios, that there's contentment, but there's also approval by God. And the second week, we talked about how a blessed life is a life that is lived righteously, and that we have good standing before the people around us, as well as we have good standing before God. That in God's eyes, we are righteous, and that is a blessed life. Well, today we're continuing that conversation and that series and that question. And today, the main theme of today is actually called a kingdom life. So, from God's perspective, a blessed life is a life that is lived comprised around what He usually calls kingdom life. What do people in a kingdom live and act and behave like? If you remember, Israel was one kingdom surrounded by many, many, many nations. And God frequently uses this theme of kingdom to help His people understand what is their identity and how are they to be and how are they to relate to the surrounding nations around them. And likewise, that's the question that we're going to examine and look at today, right? If we are people of God's kingdom, how are we to relate with the people around us? So far we've only gone through the first four characteristics of the Beatitudes. If you remember, and they're mostly all internal. It's starting with poor in spirit, so poverty of spirit, and then by being poor in spirit, it leads you to mourn over your spiritual poverty, which leads you to be humbled and meek, which eventually brings you to a place where you hunger and thirst for righteousness and you want more of God. Those were the first four Beatitudes. And as you can tell, a lot of that was our internal relationships and how we are to relate with God. Well, today we're finishing up the Beatitudes. By the end of today, we are done with all eight Beatitudes, and we're going to look at the last four. And the last four Beatitudes are external. They are what people see, what the people around us will see as they look at our lives, and it follows from the previous four. So how we relate with God leads to how we are going to relate with the people around us. And this is what we're going to be looking at today in terms of what we're calling the kingdom life. And so let's read what Jesus has to say as what He considers as the four markers of a genuine Christian. So we're going to see what Jesus has to say. If you have your Bible with you, please turn to Matthew 5. We're going to start with verse 7. So we're still in the Beatitudes. I'll give you a little bit of time to turn to Matthew 5. But I'll also have it on the screen. But we're going to look at what Jesus has to say as the four external markers of a genuine Christian. So you can read with me. Matthew 5, verse 7 to 12 reads, "Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets before you." So these are what Jesus calls as the markers of a genuine Christian, and how when the world around us look at our lives, this is what we should be identified by. And we're just going to go through each one by one and really unpack what Jesus means in each one of these. So the very first one, right? Jesus says a kingdom citizen is defined by mercy. If you read it again, right? Verse 7 reads, "Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy." So that is one of the external characteristics that when people look at our lives, we ought to be known as when we call ourselves as a Christian. Now, really quickly, let me just give you a really compare a difference between what's the difference between grace and mercy, because these words get used in the Bible a lot, and so I'm just going to unpack that a little bit. Grace is forgiveness and unmerited favor for somebody who doesn't deserve it. So, for example, if you remember the younger son and the prodigal son who basically wanted his dad dead, took his inheritance, wasted all his money away, what happens when he returns? Right, when he returns, the dad ran to him, hugged him, gave him his ring, his robe, his sword, and everything back on, and the dad threw this huge party to welcome his son home, and they were celebrating. Even though the son said, I don't deserve to be your son anymore, I would rather just be your servant. But that is grace. The father showed grace to the younger son by not only reclaiming him as part of the family, but lavishing him and sort of giving him inheritance again. Say that is unmerited grace, unmerited favor, and that is forgiveness in that sense. So that's what grace is. Mercy, on the other hand, mercy is forgiveness and compassion for those who are in need. Right? It's people who are needy, people who are suffering, and not only do you have compassion for them, but you actually do something to respond to that need. It's sort of like the difference between if someone shares like a really, really sad story with me, I can either say, oh, I feel so bad for you, right? Or, oh my goodness, I feel so bad for you. Let's pray together right now, and we start praying. Uh, you know, there's this organization called Compassion International that many people are part of. Elaine and I are sponsors of this organization as well. And what they do is there's all these kids in third world countries that just cannot afford housing, education, even some basic supplies. And so what they do is you can sponsor a child and you pay for a monthly, whatever that monthly cost is, and you raise them and they go to school, you pay for their fundings, etc. Right? The reason why it's called Compassion International is because not only do we have compassion upon these children who do not have the same resources as many of us in America, but we did something about it. We donated money. Okay, that is mercy. That's sort of compassion in action, and that's what mercy means. So when Jesus says, "Blessed are the merciful," he doesn't just mean people who just simply feels compassionate for people, but it's people who actually take action upon it. And this is really important because God gave us grace and mercy, right? It doesn't the way that it reads, it doesn't mean that if I show other people mercy and then God will show me mercy. On the contrary, we've already received mercy, right? God has already forgiven us. God has already given us grace. That has already given us forgiveness. If you read, and the reward of us sort of being able to give mercy is that we've received mercy. And there's the Apostle Paul, he has this to say in Ephesians 4:2-5, and I'll read it for you. He says, "But God, being rich in mercy, because of the great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead in our trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved." In other words, we have already received mercy by God's rich reward. And not only that, but by grace we have been saved. And this is important because, Jesus, in the Bible, Jesus actually tells a parable of the story of this guy who owed a lot of money and like tons of ridiculous amount where he has absolutely no way to pay off. So the judge, because he couldn't pay all his money, takes this guy and throws him in prison. Now, obviously, the guy knows he's in big trouble because he can't afford to pay everything off. But miraculously and graciously and mercifully, the judge actually says, you know what? I'm going to show you mercy. I know you cannot afford this, so I'm going to remove and waive what you owe. In other words, let's say you owed $1 million, you don't have to pay back a single cent. So the judge actually releases this guy, and this guy goes out and he meets another guy that he had once loaned money to. This guy owes him like $200, $20, something like that. And this guy who was just freed from prison got so angry that this guy didn't pay him back that he grabbed this guy, brought him to the judge, and said, "This guy owes me money." Well, guess what happens in the story that Jesus told? The judge got so angry at that ungrateful servant because basically he said, "I forgave you so much, yet when this other person owes you money, you were willing, that's so much less than what you had owed, you are willing to throw him in prison." And so then the judge basically throws the guy back into prison again, waiting for execution. The moral of this parable is basically this guy who was forgiven much, but the way that he lived and acted didn't quite show that he understood that he was forgiven much, right? Because he was still unmerciful towards others, even though he himself received a lot of mercy. Likewise, here's our picture, right? That as Christians, that we've just read, we have all been forgiven tremendously, right? We are like that servant who owed millions and millions and millions of dollars. In fact, verse 3 says, when the very first week, right, we are spiritually poor, right? That we are bankrupt. So we are really in need, but God, being rich in mercy, right, out of his great love, redeemed us, and then we have been saved by his grace. So we ourselves have been greatly, greatly, greatly forgiven, and we have received mercy. And therefore, it's important now that if we really understand that we've received mercy, that we should now give mercy. And okay, friends, this is actually really, really, really important because the order matters. All right, the order matters. I'm going to show you a slide here. Right now, many of us thinks of our Christian life, and the way that we live our Christian life is, if I give mercy, then I will receive mercy. That's sort of the formula we think this verse is teaching us, and this is the formula that many, many, many Christians live their life. If I give mercy, then I will receive mercy. Sort of like karma, right? If I do good, then I will receive good. But that's actually not the right order, and that is not the right Christianity, okay? And that's why the order matters. True Christianity, true Christians, and the true gospel does not follow this formula. Instead, we follow a different formula in which we reverse the order. True Christianity is, I have received mercy, and now I will give mercy. Okay? There's a big difference between the two, between the attitude that I need to give mercy to receive mercy versus, man, I have received mercy, and now, given that all that I have received, I can now give. Okay? Because you see, the first one, giving mercy to receive mercy, that is religious talk. That is just what religion does. This is what people who go to church and do religious stuff think about life. Or like, you might as well be a Buddhist rather than a Christian, because it's all the same in that case, right? I give mercy to receive mercy is a very religious act, and it's very, very superficial. True Christianity and true gospel is when we received mercy, when we understand that God has forgiven us so much, now we're able to give mercy to other people. This is true Christianity because it's actually an inward heart change, right? This is your heart understanding the gospel. This is you feeling and experiencing a deep sense of forgiveness that then overflows out to the world around you. And for many of us, it's assigned, right? For many of us, it's something that we really, really need to work hard to internalize, okay? Like, we ought to be able to show mercy to those around us. Like, when people look at our lives, okay, we ought to be able to show forgiveness. We ought to be able to have compassion and we're supposed to act upon it. Okay, because we understood how much we have been received mercy from God. Uh, let's. This is really high level, so let's actually get down to the nitty gritty, right? How do we live out our Christian life and our gospel to our daily lives? Okay, um, let's say, for example, your spouse does something stupid, okay, which happens quite frequently. I assumed I do. I know that I do that a lot. And you feel offended by what your spouse did, or maybe your sibling, or your brother, or your sister, or your parents did. Um, the question is, can we show mercy on the other person by holding our tongue and just whatever that we're about to say, we say just enough, but we don't try to say more than that to kind of hurt that person. Like, are we able to show mercy to those around us? Or maybe some grudge that we've been holding on to from in the far past. I don't know if you've had any grudges that you've hold on to. Okay, are we able to have a desire to show mercy, right? Maybe people have hurt us in the past. There's been wounds that we all feel. um, I'm not saying that we need to be to forgive people right away. Forgiveness is a process. It's going to hurt and it takes some time. But what characterizes a Christian, somebody who understood that they have received forgiveness and mercy, is that at least they have the desire to one day forgive, and they're working towards it. If you're working towards forgiveness, if you're working towards showing mercy, then that's important. But if you have zero desire, zero signs of we're even working towards forgiveness or showing mercy to somebody, right? Maybe somebody messes up. Maybe somebody forgets something, right? And your first reaction is, rah, 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 you're so stupid, right? Are we able to not do that? Right? That's a sign of sort of how much we've understood the mercy we've received. Because when you understand that you've been forgiven for all the sins that you have done, that if you owe God $1 million and that debt is wiped out, anybody else who owes you $20, you're not going to be that angry towards, right? Because you didn't lose out, right? You've already been forgiven $1 million. What is this $20 has anything to do with you that you need to be so barbed about? So, I pray that wherever we're at, pray that we should ask that God will work in our heart, that God will help us to see that we've received a mercy in Christ, and then allow the gospel to transform our lives so that one day we will be able to extend mercy to those who are in need of mercy. Right? Jesus says that's a mark of a true Christian who's understood my love and my forgiveness. Right? Blessed are those who receive mercy, for they shall receive mercy. Second mark, right, that Jesus says as a kingdom citizen, a kingdom citizen is described as having purity of heart. If we read verse 8 reads, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." That's the second mark of a Christian in terms of our relations to the world around us. Purity in heart. If you look at this word purity or the word pure, the word here is used to describe pure water. If I want to describe water as pure, what I mean is that water does not have any other minerals, doesn't have any other kind of mixtures, right? It's just water. Or if I say pure gold, it means it's just that alloy. There's no steel or iron that's sort of meshed into it, right? So that's what pure means. So when we see the words purity of heart or blessed are those who are pure in heart, what it means here is that our hearts are not to have mixed motives or divided loyalties. Okay, it's a single-minded devotion to God and His kingdom alone. Single focus, single-minded. Our loyalty is with God and God alone, nobody else and nothing else. And that's exactly what James meant when James wrote in the book of James in chapter 4:8. He says, "Purify your hearts, you double-minded." In other words, get rid of your mixed motives and your desire to maximize your life and wanting both God and the world. Okay? A genuine kingdoms minded citizen has a pure in heart. Um, you know, I don't know if you ever had this experience before, but you ever, had a coffee with somebody or talk to somebody and you're talking to them, but you know that they are not really focusing on you. Like they're just kind of looking everywhere and they're looking behind you and around you and they're just not really focused. Okay, well, I have to admit, I'm guilty of that. I have actually really, really hard time focusing just talking because I get so easily distracted by the environment around me that I'm just constantly like, okay, yeah, yep. Or I mean, there's been a popular meme that's been going around the internet. Like this meme of this guy, with his girlfriend, and he's holding, and this other girl walks by, and he turns his head, right, and then there's all these kind of memes that's been showing up there. You've probably seen it already, then you probably know what I'm talking about. Yeah, it's hard, right? Single-minded focus and devotion is really, really, really hard for us because there's just so much to distract us. You know, it's like we, especially when we grow up in an environment where, like there's all kinds of people and voices and there's marketing just kind of telling us like what you should get. Hey, you should buy this. You should want this. You should invest in this. You should have this. You should go for that. And if you get these things, then you're going to get approval from the world. Yeah, like people will go, wow, he's so cool, or wow, she's so awesome if you have that, right? And so we hear this and we grow up thinking about this, but then we also go to church and then we hear God say, no, you got to be singularly focused on me and me alone. And Christians in particular, we are stuck. Many of us are stuck in between, and we're often double-minded. Like we wave back and forth, like, oh, should I listen to God and get God's approval? Should I listen to the world and get the world's approval? Like, oh, I don't know which one I should do, right? It's sort of like driving, like as you're driving and you turn on the Christian radio station and K-Love is playing, and as you're driving, you hear like this amazing song, like "Consume Me from the Inside Out," right? But then as you're driving and you're listening to this worship song, you get some static, and all of a sudden like the frequency changes, and then next thing you hear is like "Despacito," right? And then you're just like, and then there's all this static, and you get confused, right? And that's really, really annoying. But that's sort of how Christians a lot of times live their life. They hear God says one thing, they hear the world say another thing, and their minds are divided and they can't decide what they should listen to and who they should follow and what they should believe in, right? And here God says, somebody who is a genuine Christian, right? One of the ways that they're going to do this is they're going to have single-minded focus on God and God alone. And they've decided that they're going to focus in God and God alone. And that's going to save you a lot of trouble, right? And that is basically the whole purpose of the Sermon on the Mount. If you remember that I told you about the mountaintop experience and how God calls his people to be his people again because they have been marinated in a culture that is anti-God, right? And this is the call again, to be pure of heart again, to have our hearts focused on God rather than divided. A nice little reward, though, is if you were to actually be able to do this, a nice reward is that you actually gain a side award, which is the other idea of purity, which is sort of, sort of goodness, and your heart is sort of cleansed. There's an inward purity because think about it. It's God and the world are naturally in conflict with another. There is no way that I can focus on God and think about God and still think about the other thing at the same time, right? That's just not possible, right? They're just conflicted. Like if I'm thinking about and focusing on God, I'm not going to be thinking about how I'm going to lie and cheat in my exam because I cannot be thinking about God and thinking about lying and cheating in an exam at the same time. Right? So that's sort of a side reward for those who are focused on God. You actually gain an inward purity along with that. But the greater reward, Jesus says, for those who are pure in heart is, Jesus says, seeing God. That is the greater reward, to see God. Right? Jesus says, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. That is the ultimate reward that all of us will receive when we actually are pure in heart. And we will begin to see God in a lot of areas. There's a lot of place when you focus on God, you're going to see God in areas that you have never seen God before, right? You're going to see God in His Word. You're going to, as you study the Bible, as you listen to Scripture, as you dwell into it, you begin to see God work, and the Bible comes to life. You're going to see God in creation, right? When you focus on God with your life, like when you look outside the suns and the stars and the mountains and the skies, and you go, oh my goodness, the majesty of the earth, like who can create this? Right? You see God at work and His hands being the master artists of this world. When you focus on God, you also see God in the events of your lives. You begin to reflect and look in your life, and you begin to realize, like, wow, it didn't have to be this way. Like, my life could have turned out this way, but because of God and His intervention, it has now taken me to a different place. Somebody who's pure in heart is going to be able to see God in almost every area of life, whether they desire it or not. But we should all desire this, right? We should all desire to be able to see God. That we all should desire to see God at work in our lives, but also see God at work in other people's lives as well. That should be the ultimate desire. Someone once asked Helen Keller, if you know her, she is the blind and deaf author. Somebody once asked her, like, isn't it terrible to be blind? And of course, she's the first person who is blind and deaf to receive a bachelor's from Harvard University. Many of you probably have read or heard her poems and her writings before. But this is what Helen Keller responded to the reporter. And I thought it was such a profound thing that I just had to share it with you. But Helen Keller said, better to be blind and see with your heart than to have two good eyes and see nothing. Like, like just like that sink in a little bit. Like, better to be blind and see with your eyes, right, than see with your heart, than to have two good eyes and see nothing. It would be such a tragedy if God is right there in front of us and right before us, but we miss the opportunity to see Him because we're always looking around the corner. We're always trying to see what's behind us, when God is right there trying to reveal Himself to us. Right? Many of us have said, hey, I'm having a hard time growing in my faith. I'm having a hard time believing in God. But maybe the reason why we're having a hard time is because we're having a hard time focusing on God, because we're so distracted by everything else. And I just pray that if you really desire to see God, God is there. He's right in front of us. And I pray that we would be able to pray that we would be focused on God, right? Pray that you would see God, that you would focus on God. And as you purify your hearts, that through that time you will be able to see God, and that will be a marvelous thing, because we need to make that vow again, right? That God and God alone deserves our loyalty and our attention. Right? So blessed are those who are pure in heart, for they will see God. That's the second characteristic of somebody who is a citizen of God's kingdom and who's acting like it. Okay, we have two more to go. Let's go through it real quick. The third characteristic of a kingdom citizen that Jesus says is a kingdom citizen is defined by peacemaking. So Verse 9 says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God." Peacemakers. Right? I don't know how you feel about this when you first read this verse, right? That a citizen is defined by peacemaking. When you read that, like what jumps out at you more? Okay, when you read the word peacemaker, is where's the emphasis of the word? It is the emphasis peacemaker or is it peacemaker? Okay, like where is the emphasis? And I think the emphasis matters a lot because here, Jesus doesn't say, "Blessed are those who are peaceful," right? Jesus says, "Blessed are the peacemakers." This is an action word, right? Peace it's not. It's so many of us we kind of when we picture peace and we think about peacemaker, we kind of picture this Zen Buddhist kumbaya sitting in a rock surrounded by other rocks with a little tree with the wind just kind of bustling and you're just going hum and it's just peaceful. And that's what we envision peace to be. But the biblical idea of peace and what peace actually is not like that at all, right? Jesus says, "Blessed are the peacemakers." This is an action word. It means that we are part of making peace, that we are part of creating peace. And if you ever study history, and if you ever look at how peace is achieved throughout history, one thing you know, it is not a bunch of people sitting around going hum kumbaya. Okay? Peace has always been achieved through people who are challenging the authorities and rising up and calling out injustice, right? There's pain and hardship and sweat and a lot of sort of emotional fury and anger and confrontation. Okay, if if you look at just the peacemakers of history in general, right? Martin Luther King, right, in the civil rights movement, protesting the streets, protesters being bitten by dogs, being bitten by beaten by cops, right? People are throwing fire bombs in their house, right? And they're being threatened left and right. They're being thrown into prison, right? All for what? To fight for peace and inequality and freedom for minority groups. And many of us have benefited from the civil rights movement, whether we are aware of it or not. And it took a lot of action for us to achieve what we receive now, right? Susan B. Anthony, she fought for women's right to vote in America when during a time when women's rights didn't count and they were not allowed to vote. She stood up, she protested, she gathered people, they marched the streets, okay? 14 years after her death, right? After she has experienced all kinds of threats, as you can imagine, and people mocking her and people kind of like jokingly saying, this is never going to happen, right? 14 years after her death, the 19th Amendment was changed to allow women to write in the United States, right? And there's so many more of these stories of peacemakers throughout history. As I was preparing for this message and I was reading through just different people to try to achieve peace throughout all of the history, Nelson Mandela, Desmond Tutu trying to get rid of apartheid, and so many more. Like I was, I'm like tears are welling up in me because you can hear their passion, their anger, and what they have to go through, right? Being imprisoned and beaten and mocked to achieve peace. Jesus says, "Blessed are the peacemakers." Somebody who understands God's love, somebody who's living as a citizen of God's kingdom. We are supposed to be known as peacemakers. Okay? What that means is that To be a peacemaker requires somebody to be able to stand up and fight for injustice, to speak their mind and address issues with people who maybe people just want to sweep under the rug. It's having the character to be able to say, hey, there's an issue, let's deal with it, rather than saying, nope, nothing happened, let's just sweep it under the rug. And guys, and when I say guys, I mean men, we are terrible at this. Okay, we are notorious for sweeping things under the rug and ignoring to deal with issues. Right? I know I'm guilty of this. You know, like, hey, honey, like honey, like how are you feeling today? I'm okay. Honey, are you sad? I'm okay. Honey, are you hungry? I'm okay. Honey, how are you feeling? Are you like I'm okay. Right? Like we're just it's just terrible at just expressing ourselves and wanting to deal and confront with issues. We just want to go on our couch, watch TV, and just ignore the issue and never talk about it, right? Women on the hand, they got no problem expressing their self. Just kidding, just kidding. Peace, peace, okay? Don't kill me, okay? Peace, peace. Mercy, mercy, okay? Mercy. But on a more serious note, though, as Christians, right, whether you are men or women, we are actually not called to be passive individuals. We're called to be peacemakers. We are to be people who have the character and the desire to have genuine and true peace, to fight for peace by resolving issues, by calling out injustice, by calling out when something is wrong and doing something about it. You know, so the question remains for all of us, which is, on a more personal level, like how do you handle conflicts in your life? Okay, we're bound to have conflicts, right? I'm not telling you to go and create conflict. Conflict just happens. The question is, when conflicts happen, how do you handle conflicts in your life? Do you throw a tantrum and go, I cannot believe this is happening again? Do you just ignore it and just watch TV and hopefully everything will just disappear? Do you go and you like smash something and punch something to release your anger, right? Do you say stuff to intentionally hurt the other person because they hurt you? Right? How do you handle conflicts in your life? The Christian answer is we are to be peacemakers. The end goal is peace. Sometimes that does include confrontation and conflict. It does include having those very, very uncomfortable conversations that you do not like to have. And it feels really bad and it feels really uncomfortable and we all don't like it and we just want to run away from it. But we cannot, because it builds up. We are to be peacemakers, right? The end goal is peace. And to make that happen, that requires us to humble ourselves, to show mercy to one another, to allow God to understand that God has forgiven us, so that we can actually have this conversation properly. So just evaluate how you handle conflicts in your life. Don't ignore them. In my job, for those who don't know, in my job, a big part of my job is company morale, company culture, and maintaining peace in the company. I kind of have to make sure all my staff are high functioning and they will be able to work together as a team. Now, in order to do that, you might think that all I do is I plan parties and I plan dinners and I plan different events and I just tell a lot of jokes and we have a lot of fun, right? If I do that to achieve peace, that would be actually a very, very superficial peace, right? What most people do not see, which is the harder part of my work, is I actually have a lot of one-on-one conversations. I have a lot of meetings. And in a lot of my meetings, they're not very comfortable because in a lot of my meetings, I'm sitting down with somebody and I love them, they're great people, but I also have to tell them, hey, why did you send that report 4 weeks late? Hey, I've asked you to do this twice. Or hey, that quality of work that you submitted, I expected so much better from you. Why is it that you're just submitting me a draft when I expected a higher quality, right? Hey, the way that you're acting in the office is unprofessional. Hey, the way that you're talking to other staff and you're treating your staff, you cannot do that. Stop it, right? I actually have to have these kind of conversations, and it is probably the most difficult conversations that I can have, especially when I have employees who are underperforming, yet they are feeling like they are doing fantastic, right? And I have to be the one who kind of bear them the bad news, like, hey, you're not doing as good as you think you are, and here are the reasons why. And so often that doesn't get said, but that's sort of the meat of my work. In order to achieve genuine peace, a lot of it actually is in those difficult conversations. A lot of it is in those one-on-ones that I have with my staff, in my performance reviews that I have with all my staff. And I have a lot of staff to go through, to talk through. So it's not comfortable to be a peacemaker. And Jesus says, if you're ready to be a peacemaker, then you better get ready for some confrontation and some conflict. But Jesus says, blessed are those who are peacemakers. Why? Because the reward, we are to be called sons of God. That is the reward. Why is this such an amazing reward as we are peacemakers, that we get to be called sons of God? It's because we are following our big brother Jesus' footsteps, right? Jesus, who is the ultimate peacemaker, not only does his word confronts us and challenges us and address our issues, which I pray that through the Sermon on the Mount series, that at least something in your heart is stirring as you look at your faith and you're measuring yourself against what it means to be a kingdom citizen, right? Jesus' words should pierce us and makes us re-examine our faith in our lives. And it's not fun and it's tough work. But at the same time, right, it brings us to peace, right? And then we get to be called sons of God because we are following in the same footsteps as Jesus. Because he is the ultimate peacemaker. Because in order for us to achieve peace, what did it take? It took Jesus going on the cross when there's a lot of bloodshed and mockery and people beating him and making fun of him. But in his obedience to God, right, the Bible says, by his blood, we now have peace. Right? Through what Jesus did, we end up becoming heirs of the kingdom. Right? When Jesus died on the cross, when he made peace between us and God, we now became co-heirs, brothers and sisters with him of the kingdom of God. And that is our reward. That's why we get to be called sons of God. So we are to be doing what our brother Jesus is doing in the world. Right? And that's really, really important. So I pray that, if you're timid, if you're passive, if you're somebody who likes to ignore problems and kind of throw things under the rug, pray that you will see Jesus' life and what he took to achieve peace. And I pray that we will be people of peacemakers, right? Lastly, Jesus says somebody who is a kingdom citizen would actually be defined by their persecution. I'm going to read verse 10 to 11 to you. Verse 10 to 11 reads, "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you." Jesus says, the last and final defining badge of a kingdom citizen is somebody who is being persecuted. This is the last of the Beatitudes, and Jesus thinks it's so important that he actually repeats it. Like all the other Beatitudes, he only says it once. This one he actually repeats, right, twice. And not only does he repeat it, if you look at verse 11, just in case you miss it, all the other ones says, blessed are those. Verse 11 reads, blessed are you. You. He did not want anybody to miss this last point, right? A genuine Christian, he says, is somebody who is experiencing persecution. And that just means being harassed, being made fun of. There's a range of persecution from people making fun of you and thinking you're weird to other countries where they are being thrown in prisons and so on. So basically what Jesus is saying is, okay, like this is crazy because what he's saying is, are you being made fun of because of your faith? Are you experiencing some sort of setback in your career or in life because of your faith, because you're trying to honor God? Do your friends think you're a little bit weird because of your faith? Jesus says, that's great. You should rejoice, for so they did with the prophets before you. Here's an important note. The truth is, anybody who has ever tried to genuinely follow God and honor God with their lives, they will experience some kind of persecution or rejection or mockery from the world. Because God's kingdom and the world are in opposition to one another. And so anyone who's going to try to follow God, you are going to experience some sort of, persecution from the world. I mean, think about this. Many of you guys know the story of Noah. Think about Noah's story, okay? Every day, this guy is going and chopping wood because God told him there's going to be a flood, right? So every day he's going and he's chopping wood and he's carrying this wood up a mountain and he's building this big boat on land during sunny weather when the sun is bright, all right? Like you can imagine the kind of mockeries and the kind of people who are looking at his life and think how weird he is. Like, what is this guy doing? Why is he building a boat on land when there's so much sun? Like, that's just weird, right? But because of Noah's faithfulness, his family and their families were saved. Well, if we are to really want to live out the Beatitudes in our life, if we want to really live out following God and honoring God in our lives, I can't tell you that it's going to be smooth sailing in the world. You might receive some setback in life. There's actually a cost to pay to follow Jesus. That's why when the disciples wanted to follow him, Jesus says, count your costs, pick up your cross, and follow me, right? There's a cost to being a Christian. There's a cost to being somebody who is pure in heart towards God. At work, for example, let's say I made a mistake at work. Instead of covering it up, I admit that I've done something wrong. And I just said, sorry, I messed up. Versus my other coworker, maybe he did a lot of things wrong too, but he's so good at hiding it that he begins to get more and more promotions, right? Am I going to feel angry and bitter because of that? Because I try to be an honest man and I end up not getting a promotion, but this other guy is going to get a promotion because he doesn't care about God and he just lies his way through, right? Will I be able to rejoice? Or think about, for many of you guys that's going to school, okay? And many of you are taking midterms and final exams right now. Let's say that many of your friends have answers to that final exam, okay? So they all have the answers, they all look at it, they're going to use those answers for the final exam. But because you are a Christian, because you want to honor God, because you want to have integrity, you say, I am not going to cheat. I'm going to study on my own, and I'm going to take that exam without cheating. And let's say by the end of that, right, you might get a B when all your friends are getting A pluses. The question is, how are you going to feel about that? Are you going to be able to rejoice? Or are you going to begin to feel bitter and doubtful? Like, why? What was the point of following God? What was the point of being honest? What was the point of being integrity? What was the point of telling the truth? Right? The world and God are in opposition. God says, if you're going to face setback because you want to honor me, you should expect it, but you should rejoice. Okay? Or what about with you and your friend circles? Let's say you and all your friends, you're making fun of this person, you're bullying this person. And all your friends are making fun of them, they're Facebook chatting them, they're kind of throwing all kinds of insults at this person. But you as a Christian, you say, no, I am not going to join in on that. I am not going to bully anybody. I'm not going to make fun of anybody. But you know that if you were to do that, you're going to risk all your popular friends thinking you're weird and that you're not cool anymore. You're going to risk your popular friends saying, I don't want you to be I don't want you to be my friends anymore because you don't seem to laugh at or joke at the same things I joke at, right? The question then is, are you going to be able to risk taking that risk and say, nope, I refuse to do that because I'm a Christian, right? And yeah, you might get shunned by your friends, but Jesus says, rejoice, right? Rejoice. For anybody who desires to follow God, guess what? They are going to be persecuted. They are going to experience setback. They are going to get mocked. They are going to not always have smooth sailing compared to somebody who just cheats their way through or cut corners. So don't be surprised. And so I want us to kind of look at our lives, and our Christian faith. And the question then is, have we ever experienced any persecution or harassment because of our faith? Because for righteousness' sake, right? Many of us are harassed and persecuted just because we're jerks and we have bad personalities. But the question is, have we ever been persecuted or harassed or made fun of because of righteousness, because we want to honor and follow God? And if you're sitting there right now and you cannot remember the last time that you felt harassed or persecuted for your faith, I have 3 possible reasons why you probably can't think of anything right now. Okay? And these are the 3 possible reasons. Either we don't experience persecution because we've either been a sheltered Christian, a hidden Christian, or a compromised Christian. The reasons why many people don't experience any persecution is either we are a sheltered Christian, we're a hidden Christian, or we are a compromised Christian. Like, what is a sheltered Christian? It's somebody who basically has Christian friends, who goes to Christian schools, who joins Christian clubs, and goes to Christian Bible studies that are 100% Christian, and they go golfing with church buddies, and then they do business with other church workers, and basically everybody in their entire circle are Christians, okay? Nothing wrong with having Christian friends and growing with Christian friends. The problem is, Jesus says we are to be in the world, but not of the world, right? We are not supposed to be an isolated little bubble compared to everybody else. As we're going to talk about next week when we talk about a meaningful life, that we actually have a mission and a purpose to our lives, right? So Christian bubbles, which is something that I have to admit that I was in for the longest time, right? You will not experience any persecution because everybody's just going to say the exact same words: Jesus, love, God, gospel, Trinity, whatever, right? No, that's not the kind of things that we are called to be, right? We are called to be, as we talk about next week, a salt and light to the world. Second reason might be because we are a hidden Christian. Maybe, and how do we know this? Well, the question then is, do your friends and your coworkers know that you're a Christian at all? Or when people ask you, hey, what did you do over the weekend? What is your response? Do you say, Nothing much. Or do you say, actually, this weekend I went to church, I had a Sunday service, I learned about this, we talked about this, I hung out with these people in church. Like, I don't know how you respond, right? And I don't know whether your friends know that you go to church or not, or whether you're a Christian or not. Um, or praying could be really, really awkward. Like when I was younger, right? Like praying for my meals in front of my coworkers is really awkward. So maybe some of you like, hey, you drop your chopstick or utensils, like the fork falls on the ground, and you go pick it up and you go, thank you God for the food. Okay, let's eat. Right? I don't know how you act, right? But I pray that if that's what's happening too, it's something to kind of reconsider our faith and where we're at. And lastly, maybe one reason why we are not experiencing any persecution is because we're a compromised Christian. The easiest way for nobody to make fun of you, the easiest way to experience no mockery and shame and persecution from the world is simply do and act like the world does, right? Approve the world's morale, approve of the world's ethics, live like everybody else in the world, right? Smile awkwardly when somebody makes fun of God, right? You just go, yeah, right? Act as if all religions are the same and equal, even though philosophically and logically it makes absolutely zero sense. It's impossible because you cannot be a religion that says there's only one God. That cannot be the same religion as a religion that says there's 100 gods, right? They're contradictory. It's either one God or 100 gods. It is true that the 100 gods could have one God, but it's impossible for one God religion to say there are other gods. They're just contradictory and it doesn't make sense, right? And so, you just don't draw any moral judgments, you just don't share your faith. And as you do that, then no one is going to persecute you. No one is going to make fun of your faith. No one's going to make fun of your God because nobody even knows that you're a Christian to begin with, right? And that, unfortunately, is what many of the churches in America have sort of fallen into. But Jesus says, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. Why? Because, right, our reward will be in heaven. So the question is, how do we measure up? Like, how do we measure up? Have we been living out our faith, or have we just naturally settled into one of these three? I know I'm guilty of all three, right? I'm as guilty as anybody else of these. But check out what Jesus has to say. I pray for everybody who's experiencing persecution. This is what Jesus has to say in John 15:18-20. He says, if the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. If you belong to the world, it would love you as its own. As it is, you do not belong to the world, but I have chosen you out of the world. That is why the world hates you. Remember the words I spoke to you. No servant is greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you also. If they obey my teaching, they will obey yours also. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was freed from the Nazi internment camp, who also wrote an amazing book called The Cost of Discipleship, he says this. He says, suffering then is the badge of true discipleship. The disciple is not above his master. So the next time you try to live out your faith and you are mocked or you experience some sort of setback in this life, maybe your promotion got skipped. Maybe you got a B in an exam. Maybe you lose a very popular friend because you refuse to bully the same people that they're bullying. Just know that Jesus understands that it was no different, right? Jesus was abused and mocked by the very same people he came to save as he obeyed God on the cross. And even today, he is still mocked and abused by a world that he came to save. And we should expect nothing less for what it means to be a Christian. But I want to end with this last few things. Jesus says there's a reward. Jesus says, rejoice and be glad, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. There is a big reward for everybody who follows hard after God. That's true, that obeying God in this world is not going to get you it might not get you very far in this world, and it might not get you the world's approval. But as we are living as citizens of God's kingdom, God says the greatest reward is a life lived as God's kingdom now, and that's actually going to carry over to God's kingdom in the future. The way that we live now, who we become, is what we will bring with us when we enter into God's kingdom again. John D. Rockefeller, many of you guys probably don't know him. He is by far known as one of the richest men ever in history. And at his highest point, he owned probably 90% of the US oil. And when he died, one of the reporters was curious, and he just wanted to know, how much money does this guy have? So he did an interview with one of his executives, and he asked this executive, hey, how much money did John D. Rockefeller leave behind? The executive simply answered, he left it all behind. That's so true, isn't it? No matter how much money he made, at the end of the day, he cannot bring any of that with him. That is not the case for Christians, because Jesus promises that those who suffer persecution for his sake will receive a great reward, right? The question is, do we believe it, right? The Apostle Paul did, and I want all of us to hear what he has to say in 2 Corinthians when he says, for our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Now there is in store for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day. And not only to me, but also to all those who have longed for his appearing. Amen. Right? A kingdom life, in conclusion, is a blessed life. Right? It is a life approved by God because it's a testament that we are sons and daughters of God, and therefore we are co-heirs with our big brother Jesus of the kingdom. The 8 Beatitudes that we've covered have gone through this. It's supposed to be the measurement and the plumb line to where we stand and what our faith is. The question is, how do we measure up? Where are we in this, right? Are we people who are merciful, or are we vengeful? Are we pure in heart, or are our hearts divided? Are we peacemakers, or are we troublemakers? Are we persecuted, or are we compromised? Like, how do we measure up to the standard of what it means to be a Christ follower? I'll be honest with you. I failed this. All of us failed this. It is impossible to live this out perfectly. So don't be discouraged if you're listening to this message and you feel beaten and you're like, oh my goodness, I'm so far from this. Okay? Don't be discouraged if you don't measure up, because I don't measure up either. Nobody measures up at the end of the day. Instead, what it should do, it should show us our spiritual poverty and make us begin our journey with God. I know it's been a while, but I'm going to end with this too. I know I keep saying, and this is last, I promise. It's been a while, but in the very, very beginning of the Beatitudes, if you remember when we talked about the very first Beatitude, you will notice something. You will notice that the first Beatitude says this: blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And what you will begin to notice is that the reward of the first Beatitude is exactly the same reward as the last Beatitude, right? Blessed, it starts with blessed are the poor in spirit, The reward is the kingdom of heaven. It ends with, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. In other words, whether we measure up or not, the reward is the same. Whether we measure up or not, the reward is the same. And that, friends, is grace, right? That is undeserved favor, unmerited. And what a blessed life it is that we get to receive the same reward. And I pray that as we go through the Beatitudes, as we measure ourselves against the standards of what it means to be a Christ follower, as we begin to see how we do not measure up, I pray that that will lead us to see our spiritual poverty so that it will begin our journey. But once we see that, we have already received the reward of the kingdom of heaven.